Welcome back to the 233rd episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how the bans on abortion are not actually about the baby, but about controlling women's bodies, at least from the New Republic's perspective, talking about immigration and how it's a terrible foreign policy, apparently from Counterpunch, and restrictions on lawyers' free speech in addressing certain aspects of cases and how it could be detrimental, this new mandatory rule that's being implemented on them. And that comes from Just the News. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to the daily debate. So this is going to be pertaining directly to our first topic. How much do you genuinely believe the pro-abortion argument is for the sake of the woman, and how much do you believe the anti-abortion argument is about preserving the child and the innate humanhood of the clump of cells that some people would describe it as, that is within the uterus, but also even embryos that are fertilized in the frozen tray. And that's obviously why this article came out when it did, because of the fact that IVF is becoming a more talked about topic, especially after the Alabama ruling. But that's enough of my preliminary stuff. Throw your comments down there in the comment section. Let's jump to the first article, like I mentioned, coming from the New Republic. The right-wing war on abortion has nothing to do with babies. And right off the jump, that is a pretty bold claim. Obviously, this person has some opinions, so let's hear what they have to say before you start making or forming any opinions in your head. Quote, "It is no surprise that in the wake of the latest assault on these freedoms," talking about the bodily autonomy freedoms that a lot of people see abortion as, "the Alabama Supreme Court ruling that froze embryos can be considered children under state law. And there has been a wave of pungent, moving, and sometimes terrifying reporting featuring people who have firsthand accounts of the effect of this policy. Last week, GQ published an essay by Zach Barron on the arduous, expensive, years-long IVF journey he and his wife endured to conceive their son. The Washington Post's Karen Lynn Kissinger, who last year won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of abortion in the post-Roe America, reported on a Texas woman, and we know that, once again, Texas has a very restrictive abortion policy, especially after Roe, but even before then, they were trying to make it harder for people to get abortions within their state. Quote, reported on a Texas woman who wanted to have a baby with her boyfriend and was denied treatment for her life-threatening ectopic pregnancy. And this is a talking point that people who are very pro-abortion, or at least see it as healthcare, always bring up, which is there is so much ambiguity in the ways that these laws are structured that sometimes doctors are hesitant to perform ectopic pregnancies. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. Yes, they are most definitely a serious concern. They are also very rare. And there are also specific rules in place that are meant to protect the life of the mother if the fetus is not viable and it won't make it through. And normally that means that they're not going to abort the fetus because the fetus has already been dead, and therefore the only thing they're really doing is trying to save the life of the mother. But that doesn't mean that these cases don't happen. It doesn't mean that people aren't actually having these situations crop up because of the haziness in some of these laws and people trying to escape the legal consequences that could come along with it. So you can see how this author's starting, highlighting all these different cases, whether they be edge cases or whether they just be trying to tap on the emotions that we're supposed to feel as human beings when a mother has a pregnancy that she loses or is likely to endanger her and they lose a child. A lot of people, they instantly feel saddened. And that's because I think we can all at least relate, even if you don't agree that, which some pro-life people would base this argument off of, but I think even pro-choice people could agree with this side of the argument. There is the potential for life there. Pro-life people would say that is life. But pro-choice people, I think you can even agree that that's a potential for life. So it is sad when we lose any people due to ambiguity or potential people because of the ambiguity in these laws. So I think that she's laying out a pretty good argument trying to talk about the emotional side of it. But what I find really interesting is the first paragraph goes into how it's bodily autonomy, and the headline obviously reads, "It's not about babies." And my question then is, why are they trying to get rid of IVF? Or why are very, very pro-life people against freezing embryos? And I could present the argument to you. I had a conversation with somebody about it the other day, and they are very, very pro-life. And why are they against it if it's not about babies, if it's just about, the controlling the woman's body? Because you're actually taking those eggs out, you're leaving it outside of the woman's body, and that actually doesn't infringe upon the woman's ability to implement things how she would choose, that makes any sense to me. At least when I'm thinking about it, the bodily autonomy argument really resides to, okay, hey, this is my womb, these are my eggs that are inside of me, so on and so forth. When you remove the eggs and then fertilize them outside of the body, the bodily autonomy argument, you're not controlling women's bodies anymore. You're just saying, no, on principle alone, you shouldn't be able to create embryos that are human beings and then be able to freeze human beings without their consent. And the reason I say without their consent is because I think if we ever come up with cryogenesis, I don't think it's unethical, in my opinion. I don't think it's unethical to have somebody voluntarily, willingly go into cryofreeze and have the possibility of not coming out 100 years later like they planned. They're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna cryofreeze myself. I'm gonna come back in 100 years. There's gonna be so many cures to all these different things, and then a war happens, and then they don't come out. They have to take that risk rather than living their natural life. I don't necessarily think that's unethical, but especially when it's just an embryo, the pro-life argument would be that, one, it's unnatural because you're freezing the baby. So if there was an egg brought out during, let's say it was taken out in 1980, and they had fertilized it then, and then the family went on to have a natural child 5 years later, and then they decide, okay, hey, we're going to implant that embryo. So at the end of the whole thing, it comes out that in reality, that embryo was fertilized 5 years before they had their other kid, meaning in reality, that thing was brought into existence 5 years. So say your oldest son is 15, and you had the other embryo who's now 10, but in reality, that younger child was actually born, was conceived from the pro-life perspective 5 years before the older brother is actually 20. So you could see how they could hold that, at least logically, that feels very, very unnatural. And then if you come from my perspective, if you're unwilling, like if the baby does exist and the baby has rights, then, and it can't technically consent, then it shouldn't be forced to actually go through that process. Then again, things do get a little bit fishy with parental rights and rules and things like that. Depends on how much control you think the parent should be able to have. I think parents' rights need to be defended. So maybe I have to amend my position on that one for sure, at least to stay logically consistent. But I think it's very silly when the author says it's not about the rights of the baby. It's not about babies whatsoever. It's all about controlling women's bodies. I feel like that falls on deaf ears. Then again, not a woman. So maybe that has something to do with the perspective that they're coming from, because I can keep my thingy-ding, my thing-a-ling-a-ding between my legs and not do anything with it, and then I don't ever have to worry about getting somebody else pregnant. But the inverse isn't necessarily true. As a woman, I could stay to myself and then have something forced upon me. So I understand why this is a very emotional argument, and the idea that they should at least have the ability to choose how to operate their body. Once again, I can see how that is reassuring, but that also doesn't mean, just because that seems like a relatively solid line of thought, not saying 100% rational, but solid based on emotional factors, there's at least reasoning. Doesn't mean that it's rational reasoning behind its emotional reasoning, so on and so forth. And even you could say that certain strains of it are rational reasoning in that they have a rational fear because of people that present throughout our culture who are terrible, terrible people. But my point being, just because all of that may be true, just because you want to protect your right to bodily autonomy, that doesn't mean that the other side is not coming at it in good faith like I'm trying to ascribe to you right now. No, they actually do believe that these embryos are babies, because that's why it can be a middle ground with IVF, and that's why some people who are extremely pro-life can still say, hey, if you actually take out 2 eggs and then you implant both of them and are willing to take both to term if both actually implant properly and they actually start to gestate and you're able to give both of them to the 9 months and you're willing to go through with that, you're not going to get rid of non-viable ones, you're not going to create 20 and then have the extra 18 or the extra 15 that you didn't implant or try to implant the first time, and they're just going to stay in the freezer. If you don't do all of those things, you try to actually, okay, hey, we fertilize and then we implant almost immediately, pretty darn close to that. That's a pretty compelling middle ground that allows for the mother and father to choose how they're going to go about it. And what I mean by that is if they can't come by it naturally, they can still choose to use IVF. The woman can still choose to approach pregnancy this way. And she can also choose when to have the procedure in operation done. And also it preserves the rights when you're not freezing that embryo forever. You're not intentionally killing any of them, or you're not making the circumstances harder for them intentionally, and you're still trying to promote life. I think that could be a very simple middle ground that this author is trying to avoid. And that's because you can tell because of really, really strong language that the author uses just towards the end of this. And I think it shows exactly where they're coming from. And some of the author's arguments about not caring about kids, about not giving funding to preschools and everything of that sort, I think, one, from her perspective, you could understand that because she thinks that that's actually helping kids, and that's one way to do it. And she thinks that principle, just because they're defending the right to life, doesn't, and she's describing that principle as one of the key ones, when the Republicans say that's one of the many principles that we need to keep with, and just handing out money from the government probably isn't one of them that they would also want to violate in order just to make things easier for people to have kids. Then again, that's me ascribing both her thought process, because she doesn't actually explain why she thinks that way. She just explains, or at least tries to lay out the logic that they obviously don't care about kids because they don't put funding here, here, and here. So that's me ascribing at least some pattern of thinking to her and also to Republicans. So, hey, I could be totally wrong. But here's where she thinks it's actually going to go. Quote, the only reason to consider the IVF ruling a hypocritical move by a self-proclaimed pro-life party is that if you believe that pro-life is an accurate description of the movement, it isn't. It never has been. Pro-life is a propaganda term utterly devoid of meaning, with no substantive concern for babies at all. Here, no hypocrisy can be uncovered. Rather, we just have more confirmations that those who've been paying attention already know. This is a remarkably consistent movement that considers all women to be chattel and does not want them to enjoy full citizenship, full stop. And it is actually that simple. This is not a plot twist. This is the plot. So obviously, she also mentions parts where they're going to keep restricting conception and contraceptives and things like this, and they're going to eventually just put women back into the handmaiden position. The author I don't know if they necessarily 100% believe it, but they definitely outline it towards the middle of the article. But what's interesting to me is pro-life is just a propaganda term. Guess what? So is pro-choice. Okay, and that's why when I was starting this, at least when I outlined it kind of towards the beginning, I said anti-abortion, pro-abortion, because pro-choice is also a propaganda term. It's not just about bodily autonomy. If it was, let's be clear, maybe they believe that, But what I would argue, and if I was to give the benefit of the doubt, and this is one thing you heard a lot from the right during COVID, which is if you actually believe in bodily autonomy, if you actually believe in the person, the one individual having sole control over their body, why are there certain vaccines that are mandated for certain people? Why were there different proclamations that you had to do certain things with your body, even if it is for the sake for other people? If you're on principle alone, and I'm using the exact same formula that the author used, which is saying if they're actually pro-life, if they're actually for children, they would do X, 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 and X. The same exact reasoning could be, if you want to use that reasoning, which I don't think is 100% on point. I think there are other ways to go about arguing it, but that's not what I'm trying to get at here today. I'm not trying to actually go into those separate ones because that would take an entirely that would take an hour-long podcast. But ascribing the exact same way of thinking, the exact same logic to this situation would say, oh, are you actually pro-choice or is it propaganda? Because when people choose not to put vaccines in their body, when they choose not to wear a mask, when they choose to have control over how they interact with the world through their body, guess what? You criticize them. You try to actually put down mandates and force that upon them and try to violate their sovereignty, their individual choice for their own bodies. So you could see how when you fall into that strain of logic, it doesn't hold for either of them. So you could both call them hypocrites on that standard. And what I'm saying is, I think that both of them would have different architectures that you could approach it from. And now I'm getting lost. I'm starting to go off the rails. I'll leave it there because the author's article is most definitely interesting. If you have time, it goes into a little bit more detail than I could have actually covered. And by a little bit, I mean actually a lot, trying to pull out quotes from a whole bunch of different areas, and that really interesting rant towards the middle about how we're actually sliding back into a society that will just outright ban sex, which is an interesting one. I don't see that working even if we tried. But then again, I could be wrong. Handmaid's Tale is always right around the corner, right? Just like 1984 and, Brave New World. Actually, that's ironic because Brave New World, if we're definitely not 100% there, but when I read it, I was like, this is closer than anything else. But maybe that's just my perspective on the world, just as some people say we're getting closer to Handmaid's Tale than we were 20 years ago. So let's jump to our second article that comes from Counterpunch, the foreign policy issue that could decide the election. And, well, you may be thinking, foreign policy. Okay, what are they talking about? Are we talking about Hamas and Israel? Or are we talking about Ukraine, Russia, maybe Taiwan, China? Maybe it's our tariff policy with Brazil and India and South Africa, all these different BRICS nations. What could decide the election? Well, guess what? I want to read the first two paragraphs because I think they dissuade. And let's be clear, it's not that this isn't foreign policy, but a lot of people wouldn't think of it as foreign policy, and that's why I found the title kind of funny. Quote, presidential elections in the United States are almost always decided on domestic issues, but Americans care most about their own livelihoods, jobs, housing, and food costs. I did skip a little bit there, but that's trying to highlight what they normally care about. In 2024, a number of global issues should weigh heavily on the minds of Americans. Their overwhelming threat of climate change, that is not necessarily a global issue. And what I mean is, it is a global issue, but is that necessarily a foreign policy issue? Or is it a domestic issue? Because guess what? If the sea levels rise around the world, that does change a lot, and it may change some relations, but I would say that's more of a domestic issue because we need to address how it will change things here in the United States first before we can worry about the rest of the world. So I don't know if that's necessarily a foreign policy issue. That's just my opinion on that one. Quote, voters, or it's not as heavily as one as a domestic issue. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Quote, voters should also care deeply about the horrific destruction of Palestine community in Gaza and ongoing efforts of Ukrainians to defend their country. But there's really only one foreign policy issue that could decide the election in November. The issue is immigration. So, yeah, hey, I mean, this guy ain't wrong. Immigration's a huge one. Once again, I understand the framing of foreign policy because it's how we interact with other nations and people outside our nation, but it still is a domestic issue as well because it's our border. So, a a little bit mixy, but sure, we're going to use his definition of terms to go forward. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree, but we're going to use it at least to indulge in the argument for sure. Quote, America is a country of immigrants. Yes, this is 100% true. It also desperately needs immigrants right now to do the essential jobs that keep Americans healthy, well-fed, and housed. Pick vegetables, process meat, care for the elderly, and do low-paid construction work. This is, that's one view of it for sure, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Quote, the unemployment rate in the United States is currently around 3.7%. Historically, that is very low. Many of the job sectors that have traditionally employed immigrants, healthcare, landscaping, cleaning services, restaurant work, have the greatest number of open positions at the moment. So the argument from, the presuppositions that he's laying out, well, these are sectors of the economy that need people. These are normally the sectors of economy that use the most immigrants, so why not invite in more immigrants? And the argument that these are jobs that Americans don't want. I mean, for the most part, this is true. And one reason is they're labor intensive, and a lot of people who get college degrees in the United States or have lots of work experience don't want to do something that's too labor intensive for what? For the pay, for what they have to deal with in order to make a living, and they're like, okay, hey, these jobs aren't paying enough. Why is that? And let's be clear, there's lots of different economic factors here. I'm not trying to ascribe an overall, this is the entire problem. But what I'm saying here is, why are those jobs so low paid? One, because they don't require the most skill in the world, but also because within the market, there is a segment of the population who is not documented and is willing to take lower wages because they can just send that money back home, or they're making money more in the United States, where they have the potential of it, than they would back in their home economy. So if their home economy, they can make, and we're going to put it all in USD, just so we're clear, so I don't have to do any conversion rates. If they could make $5 in their home economy, and they could come to the United States and make $10 and then spend 50 cents sending it back, that's $9.50 they're sending back to their family, or even the $5 that they would send back to their family anyway, and then keep the 4.5 to live here in America, because it is a little bit more expensive. There's no doubt about that. You see where I'm coming from. You can see how these certain segment of the population would be willing to take lower wages, which the author obviously talks about and says that they are more than willing to, because these are essential jobs that have been low paid. And then the question is, look at the American. The American's used to a certain standard of living. They're used to paying a certain amount of taxes, certain blah, 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 blah. Whereas a person coming from another country can survive on 5. The U.S. citizen, they can survive on 10, but it's going to be pretty tight. They probably would be more comfortable surviving on like 15, just like the person from the other country may be able to survive on 2.5, but they're used to 5. That's what they could make in their other country, but they saw potential, so that's why they went to the United States to make that 10. Well, the pressure in that industry is, okay, do I hire the person who wants 15 and will be unsatisfied and has a low amount of skill, or am I going to hire the other person who would be satisfied with 10, maybe even be willing to have a little bit lower, and is also unskilled, because it is unskilled labor? I wonder who's going to ask for more of a raise, who's going to push to make more money, who's going to cause more of a fuss. I wonder. Probably the people that aren't satisfied with that lower wage. And that's why you don't see a lot of these people. So the argument that, hey, these are low-paying jobs that Americans don't take up, well, because we've imported so much labor from other countries at this point, whether that even be just green cards or illegal immigrants, you're undercutting the value that could be ascribed or could be given or could be paid to working Americans. So therefore, the wages in these jobs stay low. Therefore, more Americans are not willing and or eager to take up those jobs. And then you'll say, okay, yeah, but they take up those jobs and then things get more expensive for the company, and therefore we're going to feel it in our cost of living. Yes, that's 100% true. But basing your argument, and I'm not saying, let's be clear, I'm not saying that people wouldn't get mad about the increased cost of things, and that is exactly what happens when you have a lot of things U.S. made rather than exporting them to other locations, because we have a higher standard of value when it comes to our time here in the United States, and it will therefore cause the company to have to raise the price. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that, but to make it sound as though, no, okay, hey, these are just low-paying jobs. These are just the state of the affairs. They are unskilled labor. Yes, they're unskilled labor, but also depending on who those unskilled people asking to do the labor or saying they can do the labor, that also depends on how much they're going to get paid. So when you have that sort of proclamation, if it was only Americans that were allowed to do this job, maybe more Americans would be willing to do it because they would be getting paid more, because they would have more market pressure and they wouldn't have outside forces, people coming from other places willing to take those lower wages. Maybe you should actually consider that. And let's be clear, I'm not disagreeing that, yeah, a lot of Americans still wouldn't want to do that job. But let me ask you this question. If a job pays $10 and you just got fired from your other job, you're getting paid $25 an hour, you get paid $30 an hour, and you fall on hard times, and you need at least $15 to survive, you're still probably going to take on that $10 job, and you're probably still going to take on some other hours, but it may be hard because that $10 job is extremely grueling. It's all manual labor because it's not necessarily the most skilled work. Having those low-paying jobs that could still be fallbacks for people being taken up by other people in the market that aren't U.S. citizens can be a degradation. It kind of limits options for certain people. And let's be clear, it's more of an analogy. That's trying to appeal to your emotions. I understand. But it's one of those things where, we should have these positions filled with as many Americans as possible. Our American market is not meant to facilitate every single person from around the world. I understand that in a free world of trade it's going to happen, but we should, within our own borders, try to at least have a focus on having things made by Americans and have the jobs that are open in America be given to Americans to help boost our economy. Because guess what? Remittances, they don't stay in our economy. They get sent out to other economies. The author even brings that up. Oh, yeah, they're sending their money they make out to other countries, which helps boost those countries. Great. If you want to boost those countries, let's send them aid 100%. And I'm mainly being sarcastic because I don't agree with that either. But my point being, no, remittances remove money from the U.S. And the thing is, you could maybe make an argument that, hey, the money gets sent out to other countries and then they invest it back in the U.S. But the U.S. also doesn't make as many products nowadays, or at least everyday goods that would be bought up by other people, because I highly doubt the family in Guatemala is buying a Boeing jet or anything like that. Most of our industrial capacity is for things like steel and weapons and things like that, not for everyday things. So it's not even like the money comes flowing back into the United States. But that's besides the point. And you could probably make a really long connected graph of how they buy something from China and China's companies buy something from the United States. And then, oh, look at that, the money goes back to the United States. Sure, you could maybe possibly make that argument. It would be a pretty long and tenuous connection rather than letting the money just stay in the United States in the first place. But whatever. I know there will be arguments that it's going to get shipped out to other countries anyway, because guess what? We buy products from other countries too. That's 100% sure. That's 100% true, but at least it's the U.S. citizen sending the money out there rather than the government and local governments in facilitating a policy that just directly allows money to be sent out rather than the American person spending it in a free market. But, hey, once again, the argument for a free market will just be, hey, they should be able to send it wherever they want. So, it's just an interesting perspective from the author. I have lots of opinions, as you can tell, and obviously they're not the most 100% well-formed, but we need to jump on to our next article. And this one comes from Just the News. Lawyers' speech codes enforce rigid ideological orthodoxy. Chill unpopular views, SCOTUS told. So this is about a policy that's trying to actually limit certain types of speech within a court setting. And you may be saying certain types of speech. What do you mean by that? These are things that could be misconstrued as harassment. So I'm going to read just one small section, and then I want to actually read the rule that they're talking about. The Institute for Faith and Family and Foundation for Moral Law and the New Civil Liberties Alliance, each is challenging a somewhat different Connecticut legal ethics rule. Each filed individual briefs. Last summer, the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned a lower court that blocked Pennsylvania's implementation of the American Bar Association's Model Rule 8.4G, following a Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression lawyer Zach Greenberg. Any state bar that adopts this rule is stepping into a hornet's nest in regulating the content of speech, passing judgment on the popularity of political beliefs, and determining whether unpopular advocacy should be disciplined, according to the brief by North Carolina's IFF, which advocates for abortion restrictions and sex-based public restroom access, among other causes. So what are they saying here? Well, what they're saying is this rule is going to limit how they're able to talk in court and how they're able to advocate for their cause. And let's go to the actual rule, because when I was first reading, I was like, okay, they say what it actually does, but they don't actually quote what the exact rule is. They just kind of leave a highlighted link to it, which of course makes sense. That's how you do accrediting and things like that in articles. But I thought it was interesting that they weren't quoting it. So this is Rule 8.4, misconduct. And then we're going to Section G. Engage in conduct that lawyer knows or reasonably should know is harassment or discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, ethnicity, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, or socioeconomic status in conduct related to the practice of law. This paragraph does not limit the ability of the lawyer to accept and decline or withdraw from a presentation in accordance with Rule 1.16. This paragraph does not preclude legitimate advice or advocacy consistent with this rule. So, yeah, you can see how that's a little bit vague. The lawyer cannot engage in something that they know is harassment or that they reasonably should know. So the reasonable standards clause, which is, well, hey, anybody should know that that's harassment. You kind of know it when you see it, or you know it when you feel it, kind of thing, which is fair enough. But if you're a conservative, if you're a person of faith and you misgender somebody, and I'm saying that from their perspective, so if somebody is a male and from the Christian perspective, they want to identify as a female, and then a person says she, then the Christian's going to say, or at least a really faithful Christian is going to say, oh no, you're misgendering them. But the opposite is true for that person who is saying they're trans, because they think that they say that they're a she, they identify as a she, and then the Christian person says, no, you're a he. That's misgendering. So that could also, because misgendering before has been seen as hate speech, or at least intentional misgendering, so repeatedly doing it during a case could be seen as harassment. And from one side of the aisle, that's reasonable to see it that way. From the other side of the aisle, that's not reasonable to see it that way. So having the standard that it should be reasonable, you should just know, you should be able to understand, is definitely going to lead to some finicky things and could be used by one side of the aisle, doesn't matter which one, to push on the other side of the aisle. So, and what I mean by that is you could even say that, well, hey, okay, marital status. Actually, no. You know what? I want you to go read it. I want you to write out a few examples yourself, throw them down in the comment sections. I just realized we're getting a little bit late on time, and I don't want to spend the next 30 minutes going over this one, because while it is fascinating, it hasn't actually borne out any problems yet, but it very well could. So keep your eye out for anything that goes on about it. And this next one is our Daily Delight. This is the final article, and it comes from it's written by Esther Mudley. It comes from the San Francisco Chronicle. The headline reads, "Cute sheep are all over wine country. Has the trend gone too far?" So I'm just going to read one quote. "Sheep have become an inescapable fixture in wine country in the winter, prized for their natural mowing and fertilizing abilities instead of running a diesel-fueled tractor through the vineyard and spraying herbicide on sprouting herbs." And I'll tell you now, these guys are most definitely cute. And this article, while it is talking about how cute they are in the vineyards, it does have a little bit more heft to it. It does talk about, is this actually a practice that will persist? So if you're interested in any of those topics, any of that stuff, you can find the link for this Daily Delight as well as all the other articles that you want to read from today in the description below the like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine. And with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.